And this seems like a momentous time for us to be talking about these issues. To put this discussion in some historical perspective, 50 years ago this April, the great conservationist Rachel Carson died, 2 years after her book Silent Spring was published. And this September will mark the 50th anniversary of President Lyndon Johnson signing the Wilderness Act into law. So I thought it might be useful to actually start out by just talking about a few words that we use a lot, but I'm not exactly sure we're clear what they mean. Words like wilderness and nature. Now, the word wilderness traditionally has been used to refer to large tracts of land that are mostly untouched by humans. That definition has come under fire recently. So, Julian, let me start with you. Do words like wilderness or the wild still have resonance for you, especially in an urban context?
They do, but I think the word nature is a word that really does interest me. I don't think, on the south side of Chicago, you're going to be, hearing a lot of conversations about, oh, I need to get out to the wilderness. You might hear people talking about what nature is. And I think what interests me about this question is whose nature? And in very diverse cities, can we agree on what nature is? Let me give you an example that in London, over the last 10 years, there's been a debate about Hampstead Heath, this beloved area of London. Traditionalists want to cut down all the trees on Hampstead Heath and create or recreate an area that what it looked like in post-glacial times. People are outraged by this. There's different visions of nature, and I think it's our job, as certainly mine as an academic, to start thinking about and helping people think about what nature means to different groups of people. And this is not just some idle thought. I'm a member of Massachusetts Audubon Society. It's been around for 100 years. It won't be around for another 100 years if it doesn't start to think about what the Brazilians, the Haitians, the Cape Verdeans, the Somalis, all these new Massachusetts residents have different visions of nature. And we need to do a better job of finding out what those visions are.
Ben, let me turn to you. Nature, is that a problematic word, especially when we're talking about nature within cities?
Every word is problematic that we use in social and political discourse. That's the great thing about it. And in fact, our politics, as well as our philosophy, are all about a contest over those words because they mean different things to different people. And I think, as Julian said, if you go not just within the diversity of the United States, but within the diversity of the world and look at a lot of these terms, you're going to find a lot of fundamental disagreement. What interests me in particular, though, is the dialectical relationship between nature and the urban environment. We tend to dichotomize them. There's nature in the wilderness and there's cities, and there shall they meet. But the reality is, historically, and we see that in the Cook County forest preserves, and we see it with Olmsted in New York, the reality is, from the very beginning of time, those who established the city and saw in the city a cradle of civilization understood it had to find ways to import nature and have all that nature represents into the city, whether it's with parks or free space. Even someone like Le Corbusier, who built these incredible skyscrapers, argued for the skyscrapers because it made a lot of green space around them.
So you're saying that it's not they weren't necessarily preserving the nature that was already there. They had to actually create what we would call nature.
They had to recreate. I mean, the great thing is, in 1823 or 1824 in New York, before the grid had moved north of 14th Street, the plan for a great central park in New York was already in the minds of people who were able to envision, Olmsted and others, who could see what would happen as the grid went north, so that the plan for a park actually came before the grid grew up. And imagine now New York City without Central Park, and you can imagine what it would look like. I have to say something that my wife would say, by the way, and Leah would say. She would say humans and nature and the Cook County Forest Preserves should not serve bottled water in oil-based things. Of all the places, we should know better.
Arnold, let me turn to you. Let's get local here. Now, we've problematized the meaning of local here, but Cook County, what does nature mean to you in Cook County?
I thought the same thing, actually, for what it's worth. Well, I'm a South Sider. I've lived on the South Side of the city my whole life. I still do. I think nature, the challenge for us, for city residents, and particularly in some communities, that nature just is not something for them. I think the word means that that's not my thing. That means that's for somebody else, or that's 1,000 miles away in their minds. And so I think that part of our challenge is sort of getting people to realize that it is for them, and find words or help find people who can help communicate that to residents, in an urban area like Chicago. I think people just don't, they think about parks because parks are there and they're accessible, and we have a great park system here, but I think our challenge has been that people sort of think of nature or the wilderness even more as a scary place where bad things happen, and a bear will eat you or something like that.
Well, let me follow up on that then. So if nature turns off certain people, I mean, they
Yes.
sort of think it's out there, it's not part of my life. What are better words that would attract people to enjoy beautiful surroundings?
Yeah, I think part of it is just getting people, Benjamin talked about arts and culture, and I firmly believe that we have to reach people where they are. I see people who know me have heard me say this many times. I don't think you can get people there just by saying, hey, this is wonderful, come out, it's beautiful. I think once you get them there, I think then you can start to have that conversation. But I think you get there by things that they already know, that they're comfortable with, and so in some places maybe that is the arts and culture or other recreational things that are more familiar to them. And then once you get them out, I think you can start to expose them to the bigger picture of nature and what it means to them. And that's been my own personal evolution. I grew up on the South Side. I grew up near Jackson Park and Washington Park and the Midway Plaisance. And those were my playgrounds as a kid. But I did not recognize how valuable they were until I worked for the park system. And then I certainly didn't recognize how valuable the forest preserve system was until I got a chance to be out in it every day. And I'm better for it. For sure.
Well, if I can just say, I think there's something strange about the fact that peoples of color in our cities, whether they're African Americans or Latinos or Asians, often come from rural, country, natural settings, but in the city, nature isn't that where they came from. It's something else. It's a white preserve. It's where white folks go to do. So there's a powerful social dimension that, in a sense, alienates them from a background that, in a certain way, should be theirs.
It gets lost through generations. My dad's from the South, and we went fishing, and we spent time on horses, but generationally, people lose it in the city. Whether it's an African-American thing or just in general, people lose their connection to nature in cities, which is not a good thing.
I want to pick up a thread that I heard in both your talk, Ben, and your talk, Julian, and I think there might be some disagreement here. Julian, you said that cities do not embrace diversity. You said businesses get it, but cities don't get it. And then I heard Ben saying cities is where everything is mixed up. Cities are the embodiment of diversity.
Very simple. Embracing is one thing, and there being diversity is another thing. What my point was, absolutely in agreement with Ben. Cities are incredibly diverse places, but I was critiquing governments who do not embrace this diversity and just see it as a management issue, something to be managed, something to be tolerated. No, I want to see more active recognition and seeing diversity not as a drag, but as an opportunity. It really is something that, I actually look around now in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I live, and there's what I call the new diversity. Okay, in Roxbury and Dorchester is what I call the old diversity. That's largely working class people of colour, but if I look in Cambridge now, around Kendall Square, around MIT, there are these young people from around the world with PhDs. They're all coming to places like Cambridge, Mass, and they are going and buying $1 million homes with cash. This is the new diversity. These are people who cities are going to want. They want these people because they bring skills. We're actually recruiting from around the world in Cambridge and in Boston. We've got a new innovation district. So, but I don't want to just see diversity as being something that has a dollar value. We need to embrace diversity for more altruistic means.
Ben, do you basically agree with that?
Yeah, think of it this way. The great emblem of the diversity of cities is ghettos, which are one at the same time an exemplar of the real diversity of cities and of how, in fact, diversity is broken into forms of segregation and alienation and separation, so that the very thing that creates the diversity also creates the problem for the cities, and the overcoming of segregation and ghettos and so on has been the big problem of the cities. But what's interesting on the other side is that, I don't know if any of you read de Blasio's or listened to de Blasio's State of the City speech a couple of days ago, but one of the ideas he's introduced, which has been introduced in a number of cities around the world, which has to do with immigration, and that's all about diversity in cities. Do you accept or reject immigration? And this goes along with what Julian said. The reality is that so-called illegal immigrants, undocumented workers, go almost exclusively to cities, which means mayors have a particular issue to face. Their cities are full of people who don't exist according to the national governments. They're not just illegal, they don't exist, because in fact the national governments still know they're there, and as Obama has proven when he wants to, he can get them out pretty quick. But in fact, they'd rather look the other way. Mayors can't do that, and de Blasio has embraced an idea which I think is very much in the spirit of what Julian was talking about, which is an idea he calls city IDs, which is called broadly city visas, which is to say, these undocumented workers and their families live among us. They go to schools, they have jobs, they use the emergency wards, they get arrested, they commit crimes. We can pretend they're not there the way the national government does, or we can recognize them, acknowledge them, invite them to be citizens, give them local visas, and then ask them to obey the laws and do things properly, and we'll help them do that. And that actually creates a kind of welcome mat, and in the long run might even be a way to national sovereignty. And interestingly, federal governments and national governments, which should say you can't do that, look the other way because it's a quiet road to integration for people who are actually there, and the recognition of reality by city governments that can be a great way of dealing with diversity constructively.
But it seems the question here is whether government can do better in cultivating this diversity. Now, Julian, you were saying that, yes, there obviously is diversity in cities. That's sort of the hallmark of cities, of city life, but that's not necessarily what politicians in cities do to cultivate.
No, just look at the recent mayoral elections in Boston. We had a very diverse bunch of candidates, and then we got down to the two Irish boys. That's the way it is. And
the irony is, of course, that Irish was a diversity for for a lot of Protestant Americans.
Exactly.
Irish is a problem.
No, all I'm saying is that, there will come a time, and it's coming quite quickly, when mayors, when city officials start to see diversity as being a real asset. And it's about changing your lenses, look at it slightly differently. And, I think we're beginning to see that now, just beginning to see it, certainly in Cambridge, which is, it's a lot more progressive than Boston City. But we're starting to see it really in terms of, the new industries, the high-tech industries and the biotech industries, as a lot of the PhDs coming in are, people of color from around the world. And there's a as I say, this is the new diversity, and I think cities really need to look at it seriously and attract these very highly skilled people. And, as Ben said, we are, take London. Is London England anymore? It's a cosmopolis. It's a cosmopolitan city. I was there recently. I stay at the same hotel and I go for a run in Hyde Park, run past Kensington Palace. I didn't hear any English voices. I heard every other voice but English. And it's actually, London is now a global city, and there are many global cities. That's where we are. And that goes back to my point about, the plants and biodiversity of cities. We are approaching a cosmopolis where diversity in terms of ecosystem, inhabitants, and diversity in terms of humans is being matched. And we can't stop it, and climate change will only increase it.
Well, Arnold, how would you assess how Cook County, how Chicago is dealing with these questions of diversity, especially as it applies to sustainability and environmental issues?
Well, government can and should do better. I think if you talk to Toni Preckwinkle, she would say that and demand that. One of the things she does say, and I'll repeat, is a healthy democracy depends on an informed electorate, and not just informed but active electorate. When you vote, just voting is not enough. You have to get active, and so a lot of the folks in this room, believe in that and do that. I think it's, having, the challenge is, frankly, I think it's tough to get good people to run for elected office, number one, who are doing it for the right reasons. That's just my experience living living here for 47 years, and I think there's a disincentive for people to run for public office and do this, and you have people who are the exception, like I believe Tony is. But I think you can see that governments can be successful. Local governments, the federal government is a whole different ballgame, and how difficult it is to manage. But you can manage local governments in a better way, and I think having diversity in leadership is part of it. So people who understand that to get people out from different communities, it's valuable to have people like that who are sitting in the decision-making seats, who are at the table, and the senior staff are diverse people who bring different perspectives. I think that's something that we really believe in county government, and that I believe with my staff reflects that. But being open to hearing different viewpoints that may, be in conflict with your own. And I think if you've already got it figured out in your head and you have a bunch of yes men around you, then you're going to get what you get. And so I think we're doing that, but it's been tough. It's changing culture, and it's getting people to put down their own stereotypes. And there's a lot of fear about, hey, if we bring a bunch of city kids in from Inglewood and we bring them out to a preserve out in Palos, that something bad's going to happen, And so we have to work through those issues and be prepared to deal with the kids who have never been out in nature before. I think we have to be honest about what the challenges are, but they're not insurmountable. But you do need leadership who gets it and is willing to be forthright and stand up for it.
Stephen, I wonder if we can problematize diversity a little too, because we've been talking about ethnic and racial diversity, but the real diversity that is increasingly escaping our global cities like London and New York is economic diversity in terms of equal economic opportunity in different classes. London and New York have become cities where the poor can't afford to live except under circumstances where they serve the rich at minimum wages, and the division of income in these great cities like London mean an awful lot of people simply can't afford to live there except under hovel circumstances. It's also true, by the way, in places like Karachi and Mumbai as well, where you have these extraordinary divisions between rich and poor, and they're no longer just ethnic or racial or religious. They are class differences about the inequalities of wealth in a global capitalist economy, which is centered particularly on great cities like Tokyo and New York and London, and is making them more diverse in a good way. At the same time, they are becoming utterly inegalitarian and really dangerous to democracy in another way.
Now, we're talking about sustainability, especially within urban contexts. And I'm wondering if there are commonly accepted best practices here, or maybe model cities that are doing it right, for the most part. I mean, obviously, any city is going to have its problems. What are some of the best practices in terms of trying to establish these principles of sustainability that you've been talking about today?
Well, there's innumerable examples. Congestion charging, London. London has basically started charging the equivalent of about $8 to go in a private vehicle into the charging zone. This was actually masterminded by Ken Livingstone. Brilliant public participation. They did presentations, they got the public's opinion. Businesses said, "You will kill us." But in fact, what's happened is businesses are now very happy with it because people feel freer walking around on the streets. There's not as many cars as there was. Public transit moves much better. Cyclists get a better deal. And all the money, all the tax goes into sustainable transportation. Doesn't go into anything else. And the public was told, you will not see your tax dollars going anywhere but improvements into the spatial justice of the streets, if you like. So London's a great example.
Can I just interject for a moment? Could that happen in Chicago?
Well, it will have to. It will have to happen. New York voted it down, but that's because the decision was made in Albany, not in New York. The decision was made in London, and Londoners wanted the congestion charge. And Boris didn't stop it. He would have a firestorm if he tried to stop the congestion charge. So London, really, as Ben said, cities, it's a race to the top, not a race to the bottom. And other cities around the world are now trying to implement schemes like this. Copenhagen, co-housing, 30% of people travel on bikes. Porto Alegre in Brazil was the place where participatory budgeting started. Curitiba, Brazil, had the first excellent bus rapid transit system, which is now being copied around the world. We have examples from all over the world rich and poor countries, of cities that are taking the lead on sustainability. And I couldn't agree more with Ben that this subnational level of governance is the way forward. And cities are doing amazing things. And competition between mayors is quite good. Former mayor of Boston, Menino, really wanted to up the ante with the mayor of Chicago. Who was the mayor before Rahm Emanuel?
Mayor Daley.
Oh, right, that's right, yeah, whatever. Yeah, so, and there was this competition to be the green mayor, and I used to say to my students, we want sustainability by kumbaya means. I would love it if we could all just sit down and say, yes, let's be sustainable. But if we have to do it by altruism and ego of mayors, then let's do it by altruism and ego of mayors, because we will become more sustainable as a result.
Arnold, what about that, limiting cars in Chicago?
Yeah, it's not just Chicago, it's an American obsession with our vehicles. We're all guilty of that at some level. I think we've made a lot of progress in Chicago, to be honest with you. I haven't seen what it looked like 30 or 40 years ago, and much more of an industrial, heavy, dark sort of town. We've made a lot of progress, and frankly, a lot of the things that you see today couldn't have envisioned with what we're doing with bike share and all that sort of thing. I could not have envisioned 20 years ago here in Chicago. So I think you're both right about sort of this competition with mayors. I know I did work for Mayor Daley, so I had a chance to deal with him directly a lot. Whenever he left town, when he got back, we had a list of things that he saw that he wanted us to take a look at and investigate further. A lot of very progressive things, whether it's from Paris or South America, wherever. Sure. So there's a lot of information sharing and a lot of we don't have to recreate the wheel. There's a lot of interesting things that happen in different places that get shared. So I think we can do it in Chicago. I have a lot of hope for Chicago. I think there's a lot of really smart people who are trying to figure it out. But I think ultimately it will be a dollars and cents thing where we can't afford to keep going this route where we are with cars. It's not working. I think the federal government has a role to play there too, but I think cities can help to direct that. And frankly, senators, U.S. senators and congressmen listen to mayors. They really do. At least in Chicago, they do. And it's been my experience.
Yeah. I've been talking to Garcetti, the new mayor of Los Angeles, and de Blasio in New York. Right before Christmas, 15 new mayors were invited to the White House, including Garcetti and Fulop of Jersey City, and de Blasio, and Louisville's new mayor, and a bunch of others. Here's what's interesting. 30 years ago, mayors went to Washington hat in hand, saying, help us, give us money, give us solutions. And you remember the famous New York Post headline, Drop Dead New York, when in the 1970s, New York was looking for a helping hand. Obama invited these 15 mayors to get help from them, to ask them for solutions, to ask them how they could help innovate and provide solutions that the federal government wasn't doing. And by the way, I want to say that one of the things we tend to do is focus on big cities, global cities, New York and London and Frankfurt and Tokyo. But a lot of the action is in mid-sized cities. Check out Louisville, check out Seattle, check out Lyon, Stuttgart, Warsaw, Poland, Milano, and Florence, not just Rome, because it's in those middle-sized cities that a lot of experiments are happening, and a lot of these experiences, you mentioned Porto Alegre, but Las Sempre in Brazil, not just Rio and Sao Paulo. So a lot of what's happening in mid-sized cities is setting a standard that is really good and that people are, in effect, imitating one another.
Just to sort of come back to this question of cars in cities, one thing we have to think about is, and there are representatives of the Millennial Generation here. Hands up the Millennials. Not you, sir, no. No, we have a sprinkling of Millennials. Okay, you are not buying cars anything like mine or other generations. You are sharing. You're sharing a lot more. Now, I've been thinking about this. Is it because of 2008, or is it a shift? Are you becoming the post-material generation that we've long looked for? Whatever's happening, car sharing across the world is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Bike shares. I mean, Hubway cycles in Boston, Divvy cycles here. Actually, let me just stop here. Divvy, when I heard that you were going to call it Divvy bikes here, you know what Divvy means in Liverpool, in England? A nutter, a nutcase. So, I heard Chicago's going to have Divvy bikes. Oh my God. Anyway, but my point is, we are moving towards the sharing city, the walkable city. That's where young people want to go. And cities are going to have to chase this resource, like I've said in terms of diversity. you're going to be chasing these people. And if you look like a 19th or 20th century city, I don't think you're going to be as attractive to a lot of these young people. And remember, walk score now, the walk score is being used by realtors. There's a correlation between your walk score and the value of your home. So, you know, again, I'm becoming increasingly pragmatic. If we have to commercialize some aspects of sustainability to get there, then we haven't got a lot of time. We need to do it. We need to use all methods possible.
So we've been talking about best practices in cities in terms of what would help sustainability. Mainly we've been talking about transportation, importance of mass transportation, limiting cars, making biking, walking easier. What else?
Well, here's something we need to really think about, the politics and economics of this, because there is one primary enemy of sustainability, and it's the largest, most profitable industry in the world, the carbon industry. And they support the Koch brothers and all sorts of other people who have a vested interest in making sure that carbon remains the energy base of our nation. And to take that on, you've got to talk about a carbon tax, or you have to talk about actually banning automobiles. You have to really take them on. But we live in an era when we think the state is dangerous and the market has all the solutions. The market's dominated by the carbon industry. And to the extent we cede the power to the market, that means the carbon industry will win. They're about to pass, I think they'll probably get the XL pipeline, which is bringing these tar sands through the United States to be exported out again. Fracking is seen as a great interim solution, just 30 to 50 years, they say. That there's going to be a future after that is not, is not probable. So that what we're now doing, the natural gas revolution, the transitional fuels, all of which are carbon-based, 350.org that Leah works with, the 350 is 350 parts per million. That's the level at which, beyond which there's a problem. Right now we're at 390 to 400. We're already 50 beyond that. In another 10 years it'll be 450. 500, at which point the game is over. So we don't have 50 years to convince the carbon industry to change its mind. So the politics of this, who we elect, and whether we really take on the carbon industry, whether we put backbone in this president, who has basically allowed drilling in the Atlantic and who is pro fracking and so on, whether we take on those issues is going to make a gigantic difference in whatever cities and mayors do. If the carbon industry continues to dominate our economy,
can we elect politicians on the basis of their environmental proposals? I mean, is that an electable issue to run on?
If citizens care, yeah.
I don't think we're there yet. I think that is for this audience, right? But I think part of what we have to do long term, and I know there's a more immediate issue, but long term is getting more people connected to nature earlier who then think about these things. I can tell you that a lot of people who live in cities are thinking about the economy and jobs and crime and is my school good enough? And you get to number 9 or 10 on the list, you start to maybe think about your open space issues, right? So how do we get people connected early? And that's part of what we're trying to do in forest preserves. And we've got a social justice mission in there too, and it's really getting people connected early, particularly people of different backgrounds who are not there today. And reaching them early so they can take this stuff seriously and think about how it impacts their lives, and it's going to impact my kids' lives and grandkids and so on and so on. It's just not on their radar today. And so can we elect people that way? There's not enough of us to make, I don't know yet, to make that kind of difference, but we need to recruit more people to this world and understand why it's important. And I think that's part of the larger mission for us, is to get more people connected.
Can I ask you a question? Yeah. Can you get to forest preserves any other way than by car? How many people drive to the forest preserves to enjoy nature?
Most do. There are preserves that are accessible by public transportation.
Right.
Not enough, though.
Yeah.
Right.
But that's an issue, right?
But they don't have, so we get them there. We bus them out. We do different things to get people out to help solve that. And in the long term, do we figure out, working with, bigger money institutions like the federal government to improve public transportation? Yes, ultimately. But today, no, you couldn't. You'd have to drive or you'd have to be bussed out.
So driving to a forest preserve is implicit. There's the contradiction in Americans all the time, and drinking clean, pure water from carbon-based oil bottles.
You got to start them somewhere, though. I mean,
Julian, you were going to jump in.
Yeah, one thing I was thinking about with my students recently is, given the spate of mayoral elections in Seattle and there's Boston and New York, and I happened to see a piece that the Seattle mayors were being questioned on food policy big in Seattle. And it suddenly struck me, we demand to know a mayor's education policy, policy with regards to policing, and etc. When are we going to get the first food policy mayor? Because we are approaching a crisis in our food systems. And, Ben said we can't shut down a city, but imagine if the trucks couldn't get in with food, how long could Chicago last? And we're getting to a point, climate change-wise, where, having lived in the United States for 15 years, one thing I know about Americans is if the food starts running out, we get panicked. We really start to panic. And so when are we going to see the first mayor who really embraces food as a strategic issue? Belo Horizonte in Brazil spends less than 2% of its budget, and it has abolished hunger. Francis Moore Lappe did a brilliant article calling Belo Horizonte the city that abolished hunger. Less than 2% of the city's budget, and they have got a comprehensive directorate that works on anti-hunger strategies. The focus, though, is social justice. It's not environmental issues. Some mayors see agriculture as an environmental issue. The mayors, since 1992 in Belo Horizonte, have seen it as a social justice issue. And again, it comes back to, I think, this talk that we're thinking about the word nature or wilderness or food. It's who controls the discourse. And my argument was that sustainability discourse has been controlled by environmentalists, not by anthropologists or social scientists or people who are in social justice movements. And so I think what we have to do is think about getting mayors to think more broadly about some of these issues, that green roofs is not just about an environmental issue. Green roofs could be good as a social justice issue to help cool homes of people who really need their homes cooled because they can't afford AC. So again, I think my whole sort of work is about trying to broaden the debate so that nature isn't seen as something that little white kids do, but nature's seen as something that all kids do. Getting back to that notion that that notion that a nature deficit disorder is a bad thing for all kids. And I think what we really have to do, and what I've found with my work, certainly in Massachusetts, is having people who look like you, having people who look like me in nature, positive role models, people who say, this is how I got into this. I started bird watching when I was 9 years old. Look at the colours on that. It's mentoring. And that's the kind of thing we need to see. And that's why I was talking about the need for environmental professionals to match the diversity of our cities. And I joked with people at Massachusetts Audubon Society saying, you don't want to look like the Republican Party, but you do. and they do. They look like the Republican Party. They don't look like Massachusetts. You know when you're getting something right when your organization looks like the place in which it is practicing. Tweet that, somebody. Tweet it. Quick.
Well, I am guessing that there are questions or comments from the audience, and I'd love to throw it open to your questions. And it's very hard to see out here, so if you could maybe bring up the lights in the audience here. There are 2 roving microphones. Thank you very much. And you cannot talk until you have a mic. So if you just raise your hands if you have questions. And here, let's go up here.
Thank you. I'm Nita Marchant. I am a member of the Chicago Region Audubon Society, and along with my co-worker over here, Ms. Nambi Mangun. We are the 2 of 3 people involved with the Wild Indigo Outreach Project, the Wild Indigo Nature Explorations. So my question to the panel is, how do we begin to, in a real way, cultivate the mindset that will allow the people that we're reaching out to, the diverse populations that we're reaching out to actually embrace and become a part of the solution. The people that we're running into, they have been afraid. We are starting to work with them, build relationships with them, and now they're coming out. We've got children coming out. We've got veterans coming out. We've got some youth coming out. But we want to be able to open the eyes of their understanding to know that it's not just about just volunteering and going and having a good time, but there's a career path here. It's not just about going and do volunteer work, but actually there's something that I can do in the long term to sustain myself, because right now I'm hurting. financially and emotionally. So those kinds of things. How can we work together to really provide a solution and not just a temporary fix?
I think, thank you for your question. I think that part of what we have to do and we're trying to do is connect nature and the forest preserves in particular with things that are important to people outside of the forest preserve. So jobs, job training. So we are clearly focused some of our efforts on getting people trained because we've said in our plan we're going to restore 30,000 acres over the next 25 years. There's not enough people who do this kind of work today to get that done. We have to train people to do that. So we recognize there's a natural connection to train people to do this type of work. So we're connecting with people's economic needs. We're connecting on that. Health is another one, though. We talk a lot about health in this country. We're the fattest country in the world, just in Mexico, and it's different there than it is here, I can tell you that. How we connect to healthy opportunities for people to get them out into nature for free and do things in nature is one way as well. So we're working with the healthcare community to get doctors to prescribe to patients, you need to go out and walk out in nature 3 days a week for an hour a day or something like that. So connecting with things that are important to people today so you can deal with your diabetes. Things that are important to them today. And then I firmly believe once you get people out and they have positive experiences, and that's our job to make sure that happens, they're going to want to a large percentage of them are going to want to come back and be involved with nature just because, you know what, we had a great time. We saw some really interesting animals. I feel better today because I went out yesterday. I think all those things happen, but it's an evolution for people because it's foreign to them today, and they're fearful in some cases.
One thing that I've noticed with my work with Massachusetts Audubon Society is, I mean, number one, there's a really good nature centre right in the centre of Mattapan, Dorchester, Roxbury, a very low-income minority neighbourhood. Beautiful LEED platinum building. The staff is diverse. They've got this programme of teen ambassadors who are kids from local high schools, diverse kids from local high schools who are paid and get privileges at the nature centre, and they take the message to their schools. So it's networking, you know, positive imagery. These are all the things that I think are really important. But I think getting back as well to, and I don't know about the spatial distribution of opportunities for kids, but I would say that, you know, if public transit is you know, poor to some of these places, people are going to see these as in somebody else's neighbourhood. They're going to see them as somebody else's places. So, you know, getting kids involved in nature on the street. Now, let's not forget, streets have nature. People's backyards have nature. You can do a whole load of stuff in where people live. And it's about placemaking and place understanding and getting kids to understand that this is their place. And so there's been a big movement, certainly in the US, but also in the UK and other places, to not always take kids to somebody else's nature. You know, that can alienate. Why not show you've got nature here, and, you know, and it's up to you to look after it and define it and, you know, find out what your interest is in it. I think that's a way forward.
Let's go back there.
One of the big problems that cities face these days is getting revenue, particularly from corporations. Corporations used to be part of the cities, especially the mom and pops. Well, that's not happening with the global economy. And these corporations are quite willing to move to, you know, Alabama or South America, anywhere to get the cheapest labor. So, but how can we keep those kinds of jobs in the cities to make them actually feel connected to the community?
Well, you point to a fundamental problem. It's not just that corporations leave cities or leave the country to chase cheap labor, child labor, low environmental standards, and so on that allow them to produce at a profit, which is why we need a global governance system, not just a national governance system, because as long as it's a race to the bottom and corporations can seek out the places that have the lousiest labor laws, the lousiest environmental and safety records and so on to make, you know, more profits, we've got that problem. But the fact is, and this is what's important about cities, is that cities have already found a way to do these things, but the big restriction isn't the corporations. The restriction is that while cities produce 80% of GDP and something like 82% of tax revenues, they get back only about a half of what they produce because it goes out to the state, it goes out to the federal level. And I think we need a political movement that 80% of Americans live in cities. If Americans who live in cities demand that more of the tax revenues come back to the cities, they can force the state and national legislatures to do it. They don't. In fact, I'm proposing an urban party, a party of the urban interest that says let's the 80% of Americans who live in cities and produce the wealth get a little better back. I mean, they don't have to get it all back. They obviously have to pay for some of the things for the country. But one of the ironies in our country is that the Tea Party argues that lazy people in the cities are taking all the tax revenues and spending it on welfare. The reality is 65% of welfare payments go to the very counties that elect Tea Party folks around the country. The wealth is going the other way, folks. It's leaving the cities and going out, and people who live in the cities have to demand that a little bit more of it come back. Right now, the cities don't have that jurisdictional autonomy. The second problem is that cities are defined by boundaries set in the 18th and 19th centuries that have nothing to do with the metropolitan regions they serve. Detroit, we all know, is bankrupt, right? It is. Detroit defined in something like 1830 by boundaries that haven't moved. That Detroit went from 2 million people in 1950 to 700,000 today. Half the schools are closed, half the parks, the industry's left. But the 10 counties around Detroit that make up actually the greater Detroit metropolitan region, which the transportation system, the Detroit Art Museum serve, that the jobs serve and so forth, that Detroit has gone from 3 to 5 million at the same time that the little inner Detroit was going down. And that Detroit has gained all of the industry and more that downtown Detroit has lost. If Detroit was defined as the greater metropolitan Detroit region, Detroit proper would just be a small, if you like, ghetto problem that the city could deal with. But right now it's been hived off, separated from that region. That's true for Chicago, it's true for LA, it's true for New York. The greater metropolitan regions do very, very well, but the old, narrowly defined communities don't have the resources and the jurisdiction to do it. We have to redefine those boundaries and jurisdictions. We can do it democratically with an urban party that votes the urban interest.
Yeah, you know what the problem is there? That's exactly how Rob Ford got elected. It was when Toronto became Greater Toronto. They brought in all these reactionary little burbs, and Rob Ford came from one of those and had a vengeance for the liberal downtown elite that live in Toronto. So, the swings and roundabouts with...
Well, we won't get into this argument. Let's say a lot of people I know in Toronto think that despite his heroin and drinking and everything else, he's not a bad mayor. He did very well in the ice storms in the winter and so forth. So it may be that he's not such a bad guy, after all.
Okay. Let's go up there.
Thank you. I'm learning a lot. I'd like to suggest another kind of dichotomy here. As we're talking about another problematization. Thank you. Democracy. You mentioned Louisville. I have a good deal of familiarity with that, and other cities that have attempted mergers. And the result of consolidation is often a radical reduction in electoral opportunities for the populations and a centralization in strong mayor, weak council models that actually limit franchise and democratic participation in formal ways. So I guess in contrast, perhaps, Porto Alegre, in which the participatory budget had a 10-to-1 ratio at the neighborhood level of participants that went on to 101 participation citywide in these vast conversations that last for months to determine the future of the city. So a very different direct democratic model. So I'm wondering if you could address where the opportunities are for direct democracy as a driver for sustainability versus perhaps a definition of sustainability in terms of efficiency, which justifies bureaucratization, even though it has nice green output. So direct democracy versus more bureaucratic city politics. Thank you.
Who wants to take that?
The word democracy.
I'll be happy to. But I wrote a book called Strong Democracy in the 1980s, which was about participatory democracy and greater engagement. And you're right, you put your finger on a fundamental problem of modern democracy. The larger the scale, the less the participation, the more bureaucracy, the more alienation, the less democracy. And that's why we have a national government designed around representative democracy that doesn't work very well because the representatives are so far away. But the answer is, among others, federalism. I mean, in America, the federal system that decentralizes, that devolves freedoms down to states and localities work, that model should be worked in cities as well. You're right. When cities get larger and larger, more and more centralized, you're going to lose the opportunities for participation and engagement that, for me, define the good city and make it such a great place. That means you've got to have more district jurisdictions. You have to have more devolution. In fact, participatory budgeting works best in districts, not with the mayor saying, here's 10 million for the whole city, but here's $1 million for each of 16 districts. And you guys figure out what you want to do and how you want to make it work. So you've got to, as cities grow in size and population, you've got to devolve the powers and make sure there's a kind of federal structure within it. That's one answer, because cities are, in fact, built on neighborhoods. Even London, in its gigantic size, is still a city of villages, and New York is a village of neighborhoods. And you've got to keep those neighborhoods intact as the central and first instance participatory mechanism. So I think that's how you do it. I mean, the simple answer to your question, not simple at all, good question, is as Jefferson said, the remedy for the deficits of democracy is more democracy. And we have to figure out how to get more democracy, even as we're growing in size, growing in population, which makes democracy more difficult. So it's a great question. It's a question that we have to address if we're going to, as I say, expand the limits of cities so that they're better able to deal jurisdictionally and financially with their problems, but won't they, as you say, then lose the very democracy that makes them desirable? So that's a key and important question.
But let's come back to the question of climate change, what we talked about earlier. I mean, can you really deal with climate change at this very local level? Don't you need larger governing bodies to make laws to limit carbon emissions?
Well, I think you need both. I mean, take the glee in the US media when China was announced as the biggest carbon dioxide producer. There was glee. One thing the US media forgot to mention was that per capita we're still way ahead of the Chinese. But the second thing, and this is I think more damning, is whose carbon dioxide is that China is producing? It's producing it for all of us. It's the workshop of the world. We all own China's carbon production. And so there's this concept now of the environmental laundry. We are laundering our carbon dioxide through China. Environmental laundering. Tweet. I'm not obsessed, really. But what a great concept, the environmental laundry. We are laundering our carbon dioxide through places like China. And talk about interdependence. I mean, that is a really a big issue. So there's now a whole new area in geographic study of the geographies of carbon governance. And it is coming to the conclusion that we need a global governance around this. We need a strengthened global governance. But we also need city-level working. We need multi-layered approaches, I think, to climate change, which is a wicked issue as such.
Government has in my mind, has a responsibility to do things that the market won't do on its own. And that takes leadership. And, I can't answer like these two gentlemen would answer, because they study a lot more than I have, obviously. But I think that if we, as an informed electorate, pursue our agenda with respect to the environment, and we elect people who get it, those kind of decisions get made at city. I've worked with mayors. I'm now working with the county board president. Those type of folks can make policy that will sort of be replicated in other places, because local county governments and cities do look at each other and what they do, and they're looking for new ideas. So I think we can do it at that level, at this larger national scale. I don't know the answer, but I do think there's things that we do at the local level that bubble up into much bigger things over time.
Well, there's a lot we can do, and just one specific example, which I didn't give you before. Los Angeles, I mentioned, under Villaraigosa, under the last 6 years, it turns out 40% of the carbon emissions of Los Angeles come not, you'd think, from the freeways, but from the port, which is the largest port in the United States. And thousands of freighters come in every month, and they sit and idle with their diesel engines running, and they load and they offload. 12,000 trucks a day come in, load and offload. 40% of the carbon emissions. Mayor Villaraigosa developed a program. He asked Obama to help. Obama said, sorry, I can't help. Do it yourself. He did it himself with private-public ventures. He required that every ship coming into Los Angeles have electricity so they can plug in the way the yachts do and turn off their engines, their idling engines while they're there. He upgraded the 12,000 trucks and required that they have hybrid engines. And the result was about a 40 to 50% reduction in the carbon emissions from the port. You do the math, that's 40% of the carbon emissions in LA. It had a profound effect. And if up to 80% of carbon emissions actually come from cities, greater metropolitan regions, there's a lot you can do, whether states and the national government does anything. And that's true in Shanghai and Beijing and Chongqing and Karachi, as well as New York and Los Angeles.
I'll just make another point in addition to the seeming dichotomy between direct democracy and the bureaucracy. Well, you know, the classic case was the transportation programs in New York, which showed that, you know, you had, you know, a mayor that really wanted to get something done. You had a visionary transportation commissioner, Janet Siddiq Khan. You had hugely effective transportation alternatives groups in New York City, and they formed a policy planning coalition like we've never seen. And that coalition really pushed change into the streets of New York. That's one of the areas I think Bloomberg was probably most successful in, was getting his transportation policy through. But he couldn't have done it without this incredible voluntary sector that was really trying to push for change as well.
We have many more questions, but we have no more time. Thank you so much for being a wonderful audience, and thank you to the panelists.